Hello everyone and welcome to Azam Shar Weekly. And in this video, I want to discuss that how you can unit test your domain logic in your SwiftData or even core data applications. So this question was sent to me by one of my students or one of the viewers of YouTube videos that they're trying to use SwiftData and they're trying to implement the MVVM design pattern. And my immediate response was that don't do that. Don't implement the MVVM design pattern with SwiftData because you will be in a lot of trouble and it's not going to work correctly. And then I recently discovered that there was the discussion was going on with the same exact guideline or same exact topic where Michaela was asking that about how to implement MVVM with Swift data or core data. And Paul Hudson, as you can see, he replied over here that I agree with Michael. Michael was basically saying that don't use MVVM with Swift data. MVVM worked in some places with pure Swift UI, but in Swift data, you're fighting the system at every step of the way. I'm not sure, blah, blah, blah. And basically, he's saying that don't do that. Now, the question then becomes that, okay, if you're not going to be using MVVM design pattern with Swift data, how would you test your applications? And this kind of interaction again is going down over here also on Mastodon, where Paul Hudson is saying the same thing, that if you're using MVVM, I'm suggesting that you don't. It's really not pleasant. All right. So let's go and try to talk about how would you test your application then. And we're testing, or we're trying to say that how do we test the domain logic, the heart of your application? All right, not the UI part of it. UI we'll talk about sometime later, but how do we test the domain logic of your application? So what are we building? Well, we're building a very simple thing, a silly thing kind of, where we will have a recipe and we will have ingredients. And if you selected the recipe for the course for dessert, then the ingredient that you can add to that recipe, it must be sweet. It has to be sweet or else it's not going to work. Kind of a silly app and not really a practical scenario per se. I'm not a baker, but I'm sure that if you're building a cake, then you can put a lot of different things in there which are not sweet. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and create the models folder because I do want to create some models over here. So let's go ahead and add recipe. So I'll simply say recipe. And let me go ahead and add a recipe model. So the first thing I'm going to do is import Swift data. And I'm just going to quickly go ahead and add the recipe model. It's going to complain because I don't really have the ingredient. Don't worry about that. We will add that later. There we go. So recipe is right there. It's complaining. I don't have the ingredient. I don't have the course. Not to worry because I'm just going to go ahead and add a course right there. And I'm also going to go ahead and add ingredient. Obviously, you should probably make different files, but this is just for fun. Okay, so we have the recipe, we have the ingredient, we have the course. You can move out the ingredient into a separate file. That's perfectly fine. So this is fine, right? I mean, you have the recipe that consists of the name, the course, and a recipe. Like if you're building a cake, many different kind of ingredients can go in the cake. But what we want to test is when you're adding an ingredient to a particular recipe. All right. So over here in the recipe, we will say add ingredient, and we will pass in the ingredient. And this function is the one that can actually throw an error. And we first want to check that if the ingredient, since the ingredient has one property called is sweet, so we want to check that we can add that particular ingredient to a particular recipe based on this course, which basically means that if you're making a dessert, if your recipe is a dessert, then your ingredient must be sweet. It has to be sweet. right? Now, again, I'm not a baker, I'm not a cook. If you're building a cake, then yes, there will be some things that may not be sweet. So don't comment that, hey, what, I made a cake and I put salt in there. Oh, good for you. All right. Okay. So we need to check that part. So I'm going to go ahead and create a private function over here. Is ingredient, this is the one that's actually going to be checking. Ingredient valid for course, and we are going to be passing in the ingredient. We'll get the ingredient, and it's going to simply return us true or false. Now, this is where we'll do some silly stuff. We'll simply go ahead and perform a switch on the course. And for starter, we'll say false. We don't really care right now. We'll say false. And for dessert, yeah, we'll say ingredient. If the ingredient is sweet, then yes, that ingredient is good for the dessert. All right. And now we go back to the add ingredient and perform this check. So if the is ingredient valid for the course and passing in, or valid for the recipe, you can also say, and then you can say ingredient, you can pass in the ingredient. So if it is valid for that particular course, then we can say ingredients dot append, and we will go ahead and add an ingredient. All right, there we go. Else we have a problem. I mean, you're probably trying to add some salt into making a cake or into a dessert, and we are not going to allow it, even though in real life, I don't know if that's possible or not. That's not the point. But in our app, it's just not possible for the ingredient to be not sweet. So I'm going to go ahead and add ingredient validation error. And this is where we can go ahead and throw that particular error. Throw ingredient validation error, invalid ingredient. So already you can see that all the logic, the domain logic, is right there in your actual model, right? So you didn't really have to create a view model for anything. And as Paul was actually also saying, you will be in a bit of a pain. You will be fighting the system every step of the way. That's a very important part that Paul is mentioning over here, is that you're going to be in a lot of trouble if you go with that route, right? Because SwiftData core data is developed in a certain way where you don't have to create additional layers. As you can see, I didn't really create any view model, like a recipe list view model, recipe view model. I'm just saying recipe, and that's my model, and that is directly, I'm going to be using it in the view itself. All right. So this is it. This is the logic. This is the part of the logic that we want to test it out. Now, keeping in mind that this is a private function. So in order to test it out, we're not going to make it public because this is not exposed to the real world directly. It is being used, but it is being used because of the add ingredient. So you only test the things that are publicly available. It's called the modules that you are exporting, the functions that is available to the caller. And the only function that is available to the caller right now with actual logic is add ingredient. So you're just going to check add ingredient, and it is going to test out is ingredient valid for course. So now let's go ahead and add another project. So we're going to say add target. And this is where we're going to add the target for the test. And we're going to select the unit testing bundle. That's perfectly fine. So now we will go ahead and write our test that will test for all of these things. All right. So I'm going to remove a couple of different things over here. We don't need all of that stuff. There we go. The name of the test. Let's go ahead and write the name of the test. Test throw exception when invalid ingredient is added to recipe. Okay, that's nice and descriptive, I think. So that's fine. Now, how do we use the test? How do we run the test? And since we will be running the test and using SwiftData, let's go ahead and first import SwiftData. All right, so that's the first thing. The other thing is we do need the model context. If we don't have the model context, then nothing is going to work correctly. If I go back to my actual app You can see that right now on the content view, I'm not really doing anything. We only have the recipe stuff, so that's fine. But in our test, we do need to create the model context so we can, use it. So first thing I'm going to do is create, or just going to say model context, which will be context, but I still have to initialize it. And this is where you can create a model container, like just for the testing itself. So let's go ahead and I'll add a model mock container. Mock container. It's only available to the UI demo test target, so make sure that this one is only checked. And the whole point of the mock container is to literally just give you access to a container, which will eventually give you the context that you can use for SwiftData applications. So let me go ahead and import SwiftData also. And this is our mock container. All right. Now it's complaining that, well, I don't really have any access to the recipe. So let's go back to the recipe and make sure that this particular file is added to the target membership for the UI, the unit test also. So let's check that. Let's go back to the mock container. Let's see what the mock container is actually doing. All right, so now it should be okay. So in the mock container, we are using model container to create a container. And one of the things you will note over here is that is stored in memory only is true. Again, if I want to write, you can do that. That's perfectly fine. But you can also mark it false. All right. So true means that your data will be stored in the memory, and false means that your data will be persisted during tests, but you will be responsible for deleting the data. It's a good idea to make it false. And the reason it's a good idea to make it false is because you want to be as close to the production environment as possible. All right, now make sure that you understand once you make it false, it will be your responsibility to delete the data from somewhere. I mean, delete the data, right? I mean, or else it's going to interact with the other data. So make sure that when you're doing that, this part, when you're passing it false, if it's not stored in the memory, then you are responsible for deleting the data after every test. All right. I'm not going to make it complicated right now. I'm just going to pass it through, and maybe eventually in the later videos or something, maybe I can show you that when you pass it false, then you will be responsible for deleting the data. All right, because I have to look up the code, how to delete the data, but it's mostly, I would say, mostly a good idea to pass false over here so that you don't store in memory, you store it on the actual persistent storage, because that is the closest thing to the real production application. So make sure that you understand it. But for this, to keep it simple, I'm just going to pass it through. But if I was writing a real test, I mean, this is a real test, but if I was writing it and I had a little bit more time, I would pass it false and I would make sure that I delete the data after every test. All right, so make sure that you understand that, the reasoning behind it, very important. Let's go back over here. Okay, so now we have, hopefully we have this done, and now we can implement the setup part. So setup basically is just going to run before every test. All right, so once it runs before every test, we will initialize our context. And once we have the context, now we can go ahead and try to do something. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a recipe. So I'm adding a recipe, and that's a dessert, and I'm adding it to the memory. So now it's already in the memory. The next thing that I want to do is I want to add an ingredient. All right, so I can go ahead and say recipe.add ingredient and simply pass in whatever the ingredient I want to add. But this is where I want to assert that adding an ingredient like a salt, which is not sweet, it's going to throw an exception. So I can't just do it like this. This is the part that I want to check out. This is the part that is going to throw an error, and this is the part that I want to check out. So I'm going to say xct assert and throws error, and this is where I can actually go ahead and implement this part. So the expression that's going to throw the error will be when you say recipe dot add ingredient and then adding an ingredient with a name. Let's say that you try to add salt, which is not really sweet, then this is going to throw a problem. It's going to be cause a problem. And if it doesn't, then I can say no exception was thrown. I mean, if this fails, then that's what I'm going to do. And over here, we'll get access to the error. And this is where we can check. Like, we will first try to cast the error to the ingredient validation error. And then we will check that it is type of invalid ingredient error. And finally, I think you can check if you want to, you can check that the recipes are not really added. I mean, the recipes are still null because, it throw an error. So the error was thrown, all right? Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. That's it, that's our test. Now it might take some time to run this test because it's running it for the first time. And again, I will have to reiterate what I said about the testing with a database in the memory. It is mostly a good practice. I would say, since we don't have time to discuss that part right now, I would almost always make sure that if I am adding something, I'm running a test and it's storing it, and that, I mean, I'm interacting with a managed dependency, which basically means the dependency that I can control. And this dependency is completely in control of me because it is on the device. I mean, the SQLite database that it will create will be on my device. Nobody else can interact with it. So I will try to use the real thing meaning that the real database. Don't use in-memory database, all right? Just write to the real thing and delete it after the test is run. That's the most important part. Now, some people will tell you that in a unit test, as we're writing, it is illegal to write a test that's going to interact with the database. They are completely 100% wrong. 100% wrong. You can interact with the managed dependency, meaning a dependency that is in your control. Just make sure that when the test is completed, in the teardown probably, you will delete those things from the database. All right. That is very, very important to note because you want to be as close to the production, as close to the environment where the actual test will be running. Okay, so this is going to take a long time, but hopefully this test is actually going to pass. And this test is going to test that when you try to add a recipe, and that recipe belonged to a course dessert, and that particular ingredient that you're trying to add is not sweet, then it's going to throw an error. And that's the important part. All right, so let's just wait for the test to be run. Okay, so here we go, and the test is passing. That means that the error was thrown when you were trying to add an ingredient. So test is working pretty good, and we were able to test our domain logic. Now going back to the point of if we were not storing it in the memory, we were storing it in our real device in the real database. That is actually much preferred way. And one of the things that you will have to do in those cases is implement the teardown function. And in the teardown, let's go ahead and say main actor because we want to access the context. So context.delete, and we will pass in the recipe model, recipe.self. So something similar to on the lines of this, you will have to do. All right. This means that when the test is running, this test runs and it writes to the database, your SQLite database by default, then after the test is run, it deletes it. So this means that when the next test is going to run, it will not have any residue that it needs to deal with. It will not have any recipes. It will not have any data to deal with. It's going to start completely fresh. All right. So those are the very important things that you have to keep in mind if you are writing to an actual database. If you're creating a new file, you have to delete that file after the test is run so that every test, when it runs, it starts in a empty state or in a valid state. All right. So that's pretty much it. This is how you will unit test your SwiftData or even core data application, you don't have to create view model for anything, uh, as Paul was also mentioning. So this is the way that you unit test it. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you like this video and want to support my channel, then the best way would be to check out my courses on Udemy. And I have a lot of different courses on iOS development, Swift UI, reality, augmented reality apps, MVVM design pattern with UIKit, Async Innovate, Cookbook, and a lot more. I recently just released a course on the reactive programming using Combine. It's right there, and you can get that course also. So all the links for the courses will be provided in the description. Check it out. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much.